So the tiny farming town of Aliceville, Alabama, population 1,500, is not necessarily the first place you would have been looking for a Nazi back in the 1940s. And yet, if you had shown up to Aliceville between 1943 and 1945, you would have found not just a Nazi, not just a smattering of Nazis, but you would have in fact found around 6,000 of them. And that is because during World War II, Aliceville was home to a POW camp run by the United States government. It was one of 500 such camps around the U.S. during the war. And they could be found in every state of the Union except for Nevada, South Dakota, and Vermont. All told, they housed over 425,000 prisoners of war taken by the American military, and most of those being German soldiers. I don't know about you, but I never learned about this during history class. In high school, it was all news to me. And in particular, the prisoners that were sent to Aliceville were part of Rommel's Afrika Korps 6. They were some of Hitler's most feared fighters. They were supposed to be the elite, so-called Nazi supermen. And for that reason, on the day that they were due to arrive in Aliceville by train, the local sheriff had told the townspeople that they weren't even allowed to be out on the streets. But a big event like this happening in a little town like that, the sheriff's order lasted for all of about 5 minutes. Pretty soon the entire town had turned out to watch the Germans arrive. And they waited with eager anticipation to see exactly what kind of devils would disembark from that train. And when the train pulled up right along the highway, and hundreds of German soldiers started pouring out, the townspeople's reaction was not what they themselves had expected that it would be. Because far from the horned devils that they thought they'd be seeing get off the trains, what they saw instead was just a bunch of whipped kids. Young, beat up, scared. Many were seriously injured. Many were even disfigured. But the truth is, even if they had been horned devils, even if they hadn't felt a modicum of compassion for these Nazi prisoners of war, it wouldn't have mattered all that much. And I say that because before these prisoners had arrived at Camp Aliceville, the do's and don'ts of the Geneva Conventions had been drilled into the heads of the officers who were running the camp. There were posters and reminders almost everywhere you looked around the camp. Forged in the aftermath of World War I, the Geneva Conventions of 1929 basically said that prisoners of war needed a certain amount of food every day, and that they were entitled to the same quality of rations, clothing, and living quarters as were afforded to our own troops. There were also rules about medical attention and needing to pay them for any labor that they did. So following these international laws, the German prisoners were treated with dignity from day one. But something truly remarkable started to happen at the POW camp in Aliceville. You see, not long after these prisoners of war arrived, both the officers running the camp and the people in the surrounding town, they weren't just living out the letter of the law anymore, but they started to follow the true spirit of the Geneva Conventions. They were treating these enemy soldiers the same way they would want their own sons and brothers treated had they been captured in the war. And this is true to the extent that some German soldiers reported that they arrived to Aliceville expecting hell, but instead they were greeted by heaven. So when these German soldiers arrived in the camp, they found fresh linens and shaving equipment waiting for them on their bunks. And in short order, they were introduced to the twin American delicacies of peanut butter and sliced white bread. They were given so much ham and so much corn to eat that they couldn't actually finish it all. So they ended up burying it outside of their bunks. And they got away with it for a while, but they eventually got caught when the corn started growing up in the spring. Within a year of their being there, the prisoners had up and running 3 different orchestras, supplied with instruments donated by the local community. They opened a school where soldiers could learn anything from pottery to mathematics to almost any language that you could imagine. They set up correspondence programs with local universities where they could earn college credit. They had soccer games just about every other day. They had a newspaper, they had poetry readings, they did a lot of theatrical productions, and sometimes they even held art shows exhibiting their work. Interesting historical side note here, Hitler, in the middle of his conducting World War II, he sent $12,500 to the camp at Aliceville so that captured soldiers could hold an art exhibition. A true story, interesting historical tidbit. In any case, word eventually started to get out about how all of these POWs were being treated. Articles started being published in all the big newspapers. Radio pundits started ranting about how these prisoners were being coddled. And we have to keep in mind that this was at a time when Americans were being asked to ration and to go without. So when your average American heard stories about POWs getting all these foods and these activities that they themselves did not have access to, public outcry began to swell. And in response, the guy running the prisoner of war program, a guy with the amazing name of Archer Leach, Major General Archer Leach, he was called to testify before Congress. And it needs to be said that in these hearings, he took quite the shellacking, but he stood his ground. He basically got up and said, no, we are not, in fact, coddling these people. We are just following the Geneva Conventions. And the reason that we are treating these people so well is reciprocity. We treat them well so that they treat us well. That is why we signed these treaties in the first place. And him saying that was enough to get Congress off his back for a little while. But then in just 1 month's time, 1 month after that hearing, news broke that the Germans had gunned down 84 American soldiers after they had surrendered, and their bodies were left to rot. Shortly thereafter, we began to liberate our soldiers from POW camps in Germany, and suffice it is to say, those camps were nothing like Camp Aliceville. The conditions that the American POWs were kept in were wretched, they were simply inhumane, and a few months later, things got even worse when we started liberating concentration camps, and we saw firsthand what the Nazis were really up to. So in response, Congress decided to hold a second investigation into the treatment of POWs on American soil. But this time there was a lot of real soul-searching involved, right? We had just seen the full horrors of the Holocaust. So in the public's view, in the view of the public, anything that we chose to do to these German soldiers who were in our custody, they fully deserve. And what's more, we're clearly not getting any reciprocity out of these Geneva Conventions, so we have no practical reason to treat these soldiers well. So once again, Major General Archer Lurch, the guy in charge of the POW program, was called to testify. And once again, he took a drubbing from these congressmen, and once again, he and his shiny backbone stood their ground. Only this time when he got up to talk, he did not talk at all about the need for reciprocity. Rather, he gets up and he said this. He said, "We are not going to lower ourselves to Nazi standards. We are not going to let our enemy decide who we are as a country. We are going to continue to treat our POWs well, not because they've treated our soldiers well, but because we, he said, we are decent people." And surprisingly, miraculously, even in the midst of a bloody, protracted war against the Nazis, an enemy that until fairly recently has served as shorthand for the very worst evil in the world, Archer Lurch's sentiments won the day. They brought the congressional investigations to a close, and they silenced even his most vocal critics. Friends, we love our enemies not because of who they are, but we love our enemies because of who we are. And as fate would have it, that is also at the heart of Jesus' teaching about loving our enemies that we read today from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5. We love our enemies not because of who they are, not because there is anything objectively likable or lovable about them, not because we're getting anything in return. Rather, we love them because of who we are. And who are we? Who are we? Well, on a surface level, you could say that we're Christians. You could say that we are followers of Jesus, but on a deeper and more meaningful level, what it means to be a Christian is that we are supposed to be a people who have had an experience of grace. That is, we are people who have had an experience of God's unearned, undeserved, unmerited love and acceptance. That is the foundational Christian experience. That is ultimately what makes a Christian a Christian. Not your beliefs, not your agreeing to a creed, but the experience of grace is what makes a Christian a Christian. And what is that experience like? Jesus himself put it a lot of different ways over the course of his ministry. He says it's like knocking on the door of the home of an estranged family member, fully expecting to be told to go pound sand, only to be greeted with happy tears and a hug, and having a welcome party thrown in your honor. That's grace, says Jesus. It's like owing a crushing debt that is entirely of your own making, a debt that you would never in a million years be able to pay off, only to be told by your lender that the whole balance has been forgiven. That's grace, says Jesus. It's like being a sheep lost in the wilderness, alone and afraid, wondering if anyone has even noticed that you are missing, only for the shepherd to leave behind the whole flock and to go find you and carry you back to safety. That's grace, says Jesus. It's a feeling of expecting the worst but receiving the best. It's a feeling of expecting blame but receiving forgiveness. It's a feeling of expecting condemnation but receiving acceptance. It's a feeling of expecting hate but receiving love. It's a feeling of showing up to a POW camp expecting hell but instead receiving heaven. That is grace, says Jesus. And when we remember that feeling, that foundational Christian experience, when we stand in it, when we operate out of it, loving our enemies is no longer a ludicrous sounding pie in the sky kind of proposition. In fact, it starts to make a good deal of logical sense because we are simply paying forward the same undeserved love that we have received from God to people who are similarly undeserving. And moreover, when we center ourselves in grace like this, loving our enemies becomes possible for us on an emotional level too. Because you can't be swimming in an ocean of undeserved love and forgiveness and acceptance while at the same time holding on to a grudge. Right? Letting go of all that anger and hate and instead passing on love becomes the most natural thing that you could possibly do. And when we do that, when we do what Archer Lurch and Jesus suggest that we should do, when we love our enemies not because of who they are, but because of who we are, it is then, says Jesus, it is then that we will truly be acting like children of God. It is then we will be made perfect, even as God is perfect. Friends, in the name of Jesus, in the name of grace, in the name of love, may it be so. Amen.